liberalism, um, socialism, and nationalism are three important Western ideologies. So, how to define them, and especially how to understand the relationship between them? I think we can understand the relationship between these three ideologies through the concept of freedom. So, freedom is the core concept which connects these three ideologies. So, we can understand liberalism, socialism, nationalism in terms of freedom, and also understand the relationship between them based on freedom. So if liberalism is defined in terms of freedom and socialism is defined in terms of freedom and nationalism is defined in terms of freedom, then the connection between them is obvious. That is, freedom is the conception, freedom is the connection. So, but first we need to understand what we mean by freedom. So freedom has two aspects. There are many aspects, but two important aspects. So first is when we are talking about freedom, we are talking about freedom as a value, not freedom as a capability. So obviously freedom as a value in a sense presupposes that there's a possibility that we are free. But we won't go into that at this point. So freedom as a value or as a norm or as a normative concept can be divided into two different aspects. So one is negative freedom. So that is freedom from. So for example, if I am living in a group or living in a society or living in my household and I have to listen to other people, or so in order to be free, the precondition is that I am free from their dictates or their subjugation or their subordination, my subordination to them. So freedom from, okay, and once I'm free from whatever yoke I have had, then it's possible for me to exercise what is called freedom to, or positive freedom. So negative freedom is freedom from domination, and once we have that freedom from domination, then we are free to do whatever we want to do. So that is freedom to, positive freedom. And so these are negative freedom and positive freedom. Now with these conceptual tools we can understand, to start with, liberalism, socialism, and nationalism. So the basic difference between, liberalism is an ideology which is concerned with freedom of individual. Okay, so in that sense it wants individuals to have negative freedom, in the sense that individuals should be free from the normative subjugation or even actual subjugation of other individuals or society or other groups or family or whatever. So And once an individual is free from those, he or she can do whatever she wants. So she is free to exercise her positive freedom. So she can become an engineer or doctor, or he can become a dancer, or they can worship God, or they can rebel against God, whatever they want to do in their life. So that's what liberalism is. Liberalism is to make it possible for an individual to be free in both senses, free from external constraints, individual external constraints, and free to do whatever they want as long as it's compatible with freedom of other individuals. Okay, so this is basically liberalism. Now, what about socialism? Now, socialism seeks freedom not of an individual, at least not in the first instance, but of species. That's how you spell it. Species beings. So human being as a group, as a species. So what socialism wants is to free human being as a kind from external constraints. So if we are talking about human being as a species or human beings as kinds, so then what is external to human beings? External to human being is nature. External to human beings are animals. And external to human beings are gods if they exist. At least even if they don't exist, if we think they exist, they still can, dominate us. So the freedom of species being means that we are free of normative constraints of nature or supernatural world or whatever, so that we as species being can do whatever we want. So that's what basis of socialism, at least in its Marxist conception. And nationalism is sort of a middle way between socialism and liberalism, because while liberalism is based on the concept of individual freedom, and socialism is concerned with freedom of, in both senses, of humanity as a whole. Nationalism, on the other hand, is concerned with the freedom of my nation. Okay, so the purpose here is to free our nation, my nation, of any external constraints, so negative freedom. So what is external to my nation? There can be individuals, so there can be other nations. Basically, that's what, and obviously nature and all that. So that's common to all three of them. So I want my nation to be free of any constraint, external constraint and dominations, so that my nation can exercise self-determination or positive freedom, and it can be autonomous, it can do great things, and it can do whatever it wants, and it can become the greatest nation on earth. So that's nation. So you have liberalism, you have nationalism, you have socialism. So that's the nation. That's the freedom of individual. This is the freedom of small groups we call nations, and this is the freedom of humanity as a whole, as a species being. So because they can theorize both nationalism and socialism, that we are actually eventually struggling for the freedom of our nation, so each and every member of our nation can be free. And socialism can argue that we are struggling for the freedom of human beings as a type or as a kind or as a species, so that every individual human being can be free. And that's what Marx argued. But in short run, while we are trying to do that, the way to do that is first establish the freedom of our own nation. And in order to do that, if we have to sacrifice individual freedoms and even our lives for the greatness of our nation, so in the short run we must do that, because and similarly socialism, although ultimately if humanity is free, all human beings as individuals will be free too, but in the short run we might have to sacrifice individual freedom and even national freedoms in order to establish the freedom of human beings as a species. So that's the logic behind these three different pursuits of freedom. And since they are pursuit of freedom, they are part of modernity, all three of these forms of pursuing freedom. Now, it is also freedom which relates them to all liberalism, nationalism, and socialism, to capitalism as well. Because if we define capitalism as accumulation for the sake of accumulation, or so that we can, in the long run, overcome scarcity, all three of these forces need freedom in that sense, because individual, in order to actually exercise their freedom, they need material resources. If I'm poor, what I'm going to do, how I'm going to exercise my positive freedom. And if a nation is actually lacking resources, then it can't be created, can't actually exercise its freedom. And similarly human beings, so all of them basically agree on the basic ethos of capitalism, that is, we have to overcome scarcity. But the overcoming of scarcity in the case of liberalism for individual directly, here it is for nation, and directly and ultimately hopefully for individuals living within nation, and in socialism it is for humanity, and eventually for nations and individuals, because they are all part of humanity, supposedly anyway. So that's how these three are also related very closely to capitalism. And self-determination, like you determine your will, it's also known as, so that's positive freedom. So individual can determine. So liberalism is about individual self-determination. Individual self-determination. On the other hand, nationalism is about national self-determination. And socialism is about human self-determination. Okay? And this self-determination is also known as autonomy, what Kant talked about. And autonomy, so you are your own lord in a sense. So this is, in a way, is exactly the opposite of what traditional religions, especially the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, emphasize, which is the priority of worshipping God. So in a sense, we can say that liberalism, socialism, nationalism, as ideologies, we are not talking about their real manifestation. We are at the moment just talking about them as prototypes. Liberalism, they have three different conceptions of self. So self as individual, here self as nation, and socialism, self as human being, as a type, and nationalism as self as nation as a whole. So they have different conceptions of self, and moreover, basically, so self-determination on all three cases, they're seeking self-determination. But the self is different. In this case, liberalism is individual. In the case of socialism, it's human being as species. And in the case of nationalism, it is self as a nation and self-determination. So all three are seeking self-determination, but the conception of self is different. All three are seeking autonomy, but in the case of liberalism, autonomy is for the individual. In the case of socialism, autonomy is for the human being as species. And in the case of nationalism, the autonomy is for the nation. So if we talk in religious terms, if autonomy is the opposite of worship, so in a sense in liberalism, human beings, an individual worships himself or herself. In the case of socialism, individuals worship humanity as a whole. So Tolstoy, if you read, not Tolstoy, Trotsky, he said that, a lot of these communists, they actually worship human being as a species, and they were willing to sacrifice them as individuals for the greater good of humanity. So in the case of socialism, you worship yourself, but your real self as human being. And in the case of nationalism, you worship your own nation. So that's the three ideologies and the difference between them. I'll stop here. If you have any questions, we can talk about them in the next video.